In the final verses of chapter 8, Paul brings together these two competing matters of knowledge on the one hand and love on the other. He does it in a very complementary way. Too often when faced with challenges, we want other people to change. But Paul is going to explain to us that what is more important is that we be willing to change. And that is rather uncomfortable for most of us. Our reading is from 1 Corinthians chapter 8 and it's verses 9 to 13. But take heed lest by any means this liberty of yours become a stumbling block to them that are weak. For if any man see thee which hast knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple, shall not the conscience of him which is weak be emboldened to eat those things which are offered to idols? And through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died. But when ye sin so against the brethren, and wound their weak conscience, ye sin against Christ. Wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh, while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend. So how do we deal with situations where other believers have scruples or reservations or a conscience about things that are not a particular issue to us? How do I act in a situation where I appreciate Christian liberty, but you don't? The first thing that Paul points out in the first 3 verses of this chapter is that I must be careful in using my liberty. I should be guided by love. Then in verses 4 to 6, Paul explains the context of my liberty. There is but one God, of whom are all things, he writes in verse 6. However, in verse 7, we are reminded about some believers who have a conscience about their liberty. They have worries about things that I don't worry about because of their background and history, perhaps. In the verses that we have read today, we're going to explore how we should be considerate in our liberty, in the exercise of it. Now, here's the problem. Paul explains that this liberty of yours could become a stumbling block to them that are weak, verse 9, particularly if you practice your liberty in a forceful way. So he outlines the situation where a believer which has knowledge sits at meat in the idol's temple. That's verse 10. Perhaps he encourages the believer with a conscience to join him, or perhaps the believer with a conscience feels against his better judgment that he ought to join him, but having done so, his conscience troubles him and he is consumed with anxiety and regret about what he has done. I think that's what Paul means when he writes, through thy knowledge shall the weak brother perish, for whom Christ died, in verse 11. His peace and fellowship with God is destroyed or undermined to such an extent that it causes him irreparable harm. Now, the seriousness of this is underlined in the words, when ye sin so against the brethren, ye sin against Christ. That's verse 12. Would any believer seriously want to do that? Now, in adding the words, for whom Christ died at the end of verse 11, Paul reminds us that the Lord Jesus suffered for the blessing of that believer. The unspoken challenge is whether it is too much to ask that I be prepared to sacrifice for him too. That sacrificial spirit means that I ought to focus on the harm that my action might cause to another, rather than the liberty that I have to do what I would like to do. So the lesson that Paul wants us to learn is that if my liberty proves to be a spiritual obstacle to my fellow Christian, I should be willing to abstain while the world standeth, verse 13. In other words, for my whole life long. The idea of riding roughshod over my brethren and sisters should be anathema to every Christian. There's something better than liberty to eat, and it is love to forego, because Christianity is never about me. It is always about others, and so we should love one another.